On December 29, 1935, Antoine-Marie Jean-Baptiste Roger Comte de Saint-Exupéry, an experienced French aviator and writer, climbed into the cockpit of his red and white Caudron C 630 Simoun at Aéroport de Paris-Le Bourget before dawn. Beside him sat André Prévot, his navigator and mechanic, a capable man with steady hands and a level head. They were attempting something audacious: to break the speed record for a Paris-to-Saigon flight, covering 13,800 miles in under 90 hours. The prize was 150,000 francs, equivalent to over $300,000 in today's currency. But by the early hours of December 30th, somewhere in the vast emptiness between Benghazi and Cairo, their carefully planned journey transformed into a desperate fight for survival that would last 4 days, without water in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, where Antoine de Saint-Exupéry was 35 years old, already celebrated as a pioneering aviator and gifted writer. He had flown mail routes across the Sahara and the Andes, navigated through storms that would ground lesser pilots, and written eloquently about the philosophy of flight. His relationship with aviation was not that of a thrill-seeker, but of a craftsman who understood his tools intimately. He had owned the Simoun for 8 months, logging 8,000 miles in its cockpit, and the engine had not skipped a single beat. Every bolt remained tight, every instrument reliable. Saint-Exupéry loved the tiny cabin of his plane, the way the mineral glow of the artificial horizon glimmered like a constellation in the darkness, the particular flavor of being suspended between earth and sky. To him, the cockpit was not merely a workspace, but a world unto itself, a home where he felt most alive. André Prévot was equally qualified for this journey. As navigator and flight engineer, his job demanded precision, calm under pressure, and an intimate knowledge of the aircraft's mechanical systems. The two men had prepared meticulously. They studied meteorological reports, consulted with weather experts, plotted their course across maps that showed the snaking ribbon of the Mediterranean, the vast blank spaces of the Sahara, and the distant promise of the Levant and Indian subcontinent beyond. They checked and rechecked their equipment, their fuel calculations, their emergency supplies. Everything that could be controlled had been controlled. The Caudron C630 Simoun was a marvel of French engineering, a 4-place, single-engine, low-wing monoplane constructed primarily of wood with plywood sheeting and doped fabric covering. Aluminum panels, carefully curved, covered portions of the fuselage. It measured 28 feet long with a wingspan of 34 feet. The aircraft was powered by a Renault Bengali 6 PDI engine, an inverted inline 6-cylinder producing 177 horsepower, turning a 2-bladed metal propeller. The Simoun could reach speeds of 193 miles per hour and had a normal range of 783 miles, more than adequate for the legs they had planned. It was not the largest or most powerful aircraft in the sky, but it was reliable, and in aviation, reliability mattered more than spectacle. They departed Le Bourget early that December morning, the propeller slicing through cold air as the Simoun lifted into the pre-dawn darkness. De Saint-Exupéry followed the Seine to the Loire Valley, then turned south toward the Mediterranean coast near Marseille. The flight plan called for crossing the sea to North Africa, refueling at strategic points, and pushing east through the night to maximize speed. But shortly after crossing the French coast, Prévot noticed fuel streaming from the left wing. They had lost 20 gallons. Saint-Exupéry turned back immediately, landing at Marignan to repair the leak and refuel. He drank a cup of coffee while mechanics worked on the wing, and the time lost hurt like an open wound. Every minute counted against the 90-hour deadline. Once airborne again, they encountered weather that forced them down to just 60 feet above the Mediterranean. Heavy rain obscured visibility, and dark clouds pressed down on them. As they hugged the coast of Sardinia until the weather improved, then crossed to Africa, landing at Bizerte, Tunisia, for another refueling stop. With 2 hours of daylight remaining, they pushed on to Benghazi, Libya, arriving at 11 p.m. local time. Within 20 minutes they were airborne again, heading into the darkness toward Cairo. The Sahara Desert is not a place that forgives errors. It is the largest hot desert on Earth, covering an area roughly the size of the United States, a landscape carved by geological forces over millions of years. Where Saint-Exupéry and Prévot were flying, the terrain consisted of vast plateaus of black pebbles and sand, broken occasionally by gentle rises and shallow depressions. There were no roads, no settlements, no landmarks to guide a lost traveler. The air held only 18% humidity, on far lower than the Sahara proper, which already stood at 40%. In such an environment, the human body loses moisture at an accelerated rate. Colonial officers and Bedouin travelers knew that a man could survive perhaps 19 hours without water before his eyes began to flood with light, and death arrived swiftly. The desert was not malicious, but it was indifferent, and indifference can be more dangerous than malice. Flying east from Benghazi in total darkness, Saint-Exupéry had no satellites to pinpoint his position, no radar, no radio beacon guiding him toward Cairo. His tools were a compass, an airspeed indicator, a clock, and a collection of imperfect maps. He relied on dead reckoning, calculating position based on speed, time, and direction, adjusted for estimated wind. But wind was the variable that could not be controlled. Had the expected tailwind held? Had crosswinds pushed them north or south of their intended track? Had atmospheric pressure changes caused the altimeter to lie about their altitude? 3 hours after leaving Benghazi, moonset plunged them into absolute blackness. Then they entered clouds, visibility reduced to mere feet. At 170 miles per hour, the simoon struck the earth without warning. The impact was catastrophic. The cabin splintered, windows blew out, metal skin peeled away like strips of paper. Both men were launched through the shattered windscreen into the darkness. The airplane slid 250 yards across a plateau covered in round black pebbles that acted like millions of tiny ball bearings, absorbing just enough energy to prevent the collision from being immediately fatal. When Saint-Exupéry and Prévot came to rest in the sand, the bruised but miraculously unbroken, the silence that followed was absolute. They stood and surveyed the wreckage. The radio was obliterated, useless. The water tank had ruptured, every drop lost. They salvaged a pint of coffee in a battered thermos and half a pint of white wine. For food, they had a handful of grapes and a single orange. Prévot calculated grimly. If they had drifted significantly off course during the blind flight through the clouds, a search party would need to cover 2,000 miles of desert, a process that could take 6 months. Their best hope was that they had crashed somewhere along the Benghazi-Cairo route and would be spotted by a passing aircraft within days. But they both knew the mathematics of dehydration. 3 days was the outer limit of survival without water. Between the coffee, wine, grapes, and orange, they might last slightly longer. But eventually their throats would close, their blood would thicken, hallucinations would begin, and after roughly 72 hours, they would die, desiccated by the wind that sculpted the dunes. As they sat in the sand beside the broken airplane, Prévot spoke quietly. "You know, it's a shame." "What's a shame?" Saint-Exupéry asked. "That we didn't crash properly and get it over with." Nevertheless, they developed a plan rooted in logic and hope. They would walk during daylight, searching for an oasis or settlement, and return to the wreckage each evening. The airplane's white fuselage might be spotted by a search plane. When the sun rose, they would write a message in huge letters in the sand. Perhaps rescue would come. It was a reasonable plan, and executed by competent men who understood survival protocols. The next morning, they rationed their meager supplies carefully. They drank the coffee and wine, knowing the liquid was more precious than gold. They ate the grapes slowly, savoring each one. The orange was divided meticulously. Then they set out across the plateau, walking east toward where they believed civilization might lie. The sun rose with merciless intensity, and the desert revealed itself in full. The plateau was strewn with black pebbles that absorbed heat and radiated it back into the air. There was no shade, no shelter, no relief. The northeast wind, the same wind that had falsified Saint-Exupéry's navigation and blown them off course, now worked to their advantage by slowing the rate of evaporation from their bodies. Without that wind, they would already be dead. By evening, exhausted and no closer to rescue, they returned to the wreckage. They had walked miles and found nothing. That night, they laid snares across the mouths of burrows they had discovered, hoping to trap fennecs, small desert foxes, and drink their blood. But the next morning, the snares were empty. Saint-Exupéry followed the tracks of a fennec across the sand, fascinated despite his dire circumstances by the delicate three-toed prints, the evidence of a creature that somehow thrived in this barren place. The tracks led to shrubs festooned with small yellow snails. He marveled at the fennec's strategy, never stripping a single shrub bare, always moving on after consuming just a few snails, as if managing a renewable resource. Even as his body failed, his mind remained engaged, curious about the world around him. "My number's up. I know," he murmured to the unseen animal, "but that hasn't damped my interest in your little ways." That day, they abandoned the plan to return to the wreckage each night. Walking in circles was inefficient. They decided to strike out eastward and keep walking until they found help or until their bodies gave out. They traveled across terrain that shifted from black pebbles to sand, from flat expanses to gentle rises. Saint-Exupéry's mouth began to harden, his tongue swelling. He tested his saliva production and found he could no longer spit. His lips cracked and bled. Yet he felt strangely calm, almost detached from the suffering. He discovered that one adapts to everything, even impending death. 30 years or 3 days, it was all a matter of perspective. By the second day, mirages began. Your Saint-Exupéry saw a man waving at him and ran forward, only to find a black rock. A sleeping Bedouin transformed into a charred log. He encountered a forest of marble, petrified tree trunks polished smooth by millennia of wind, each knot and ring preserved in stone. He felt like an intruder in a landscape of eternal things, a fragile creature of flesh wandering among monuments to permanence. The sun beat down on the black stones like a hammer on an anvil, and he could feel the blows reverberating in his temples. He saw a caravan moving slowly in the distance and called out, then argued with himself that it was merely another hallucination. He saw a cross on a hill, perhaps marking a religious institution, perhaps a permanent well. His mind clung to the symbols on maps he had studied. What fantasizing about Dominican monks with a cool, red-tiled kitchen and a rusty pump in a courtyard. But he knew it was fantasy, a construction built by a dehydrating brain desperate for hope. That evening, he set out alone, driven by a compulsion he could not name, leaving Prévot behind with instructions to light a signal fire if anyone appeared. He walked for hours, following mirages, chasing phantoms. At one point he saw the sea, heard the music of waves, saw the walls of a magnificent city glittering in the sun. He knew it was not real, yet he could not resist the pull. He walked until twilight, until exhaustion and reason forced him to turn back. When he returned to camp, he saw a glow on the horizon. Prévot had launched a signal fire, panic-stricken that Saint-Exupéry might have lost his way. As he approached, your Saint-Exupéry's heart surged with irrational hope. In the firelight, he saw Prévot chatting with two Arabs who leaned casually against the engine. Rescue had come. "Ahoy!" Saint-Exupéry cried. The Arabs gave a start and stared. Prévot turned and hurried toward him, catching him by the elbow as he stumbled forward. "So they've come?" Saint-Exupéry asked. "What Arabs?" Prévot said quietly. "Those two over there." Prévot looked at him with an expression of profound sadness. "There aren't any Arabs." Saint-Exupéry wept then, not from fear, but from the realization that his mind was betraying him. The hallucinations were no longer occasional. They were constant, immersive, indistinguishable from reality. On the third day, they had gone 24 hours without any liquid. They conceived a plan born of desperation and ingenuity. Or they dismantled one of the aircraft's parachutes, spreading the 6 triangles of white cloth on the ground and weighing them down with stones. If the northeast wind held, dew might condense on the fabric by morning, and they could wring the moisture into a tank. They had also discovered an orange in the debris, a miracle that brought Saint-Exupéry preposterously close to tears. They split it carefully. As he lay beside the campfire that night, savoring the juice, he felt a strange happiness. "No one on earth has any idea what an orange really is," he murmured. He realized that the condemned man smiling on his way to the gallows was not displaying courage, but genuine pleasure, extracting a lifetime from his final 10 minutes, experiencing the world with a clarity unavailable to those who take survival for granted. At dawn, they checked the parachute. Nearly 2 quarts of water had collected, stained a brilliant yellow-green by the fabric's coating. Saint-Exupéry ladled a draught into a tin cup and drank. The taste was acrid, metallic, so foul he could not swallow. He glanced at Prévot, who was walking in circles, eyes fixed on the ground. Suddenly Prévot bent forward and vomited violently, yet continued walking. 30 seconds later, Saint-Exupéry followed, falling to his knees, retching until only bile came up. For 15 minutes they convulsed, their bodies rejecting the poisoned water. When it ended, their last hope was gone. It was time to abandon the wreckage and walk. They would march east until they collapsed. They set out side by side, heading northeast by compass. The day became a blur in Saint-Exupéry's memory. A desperate forward motion without thought or emotion, just the mechanical movement of legs that no longer felt like his own. Somewhere he discarded the cape he had brought for the night. His mind turned to dust, and only at twilight did clarity return. That night, they again spread the parachute, hoping against reason that the wind might bring moisture. But the wind had shifted. The north was cloudless. The desert was now awake to their presence, stalking them. Saint-Exupéry could feel its rough tongue licking his skin, could smell its fetid breath. In 3 days he had walked nearly 100 miles with almost nothing to drink. As darkness fell, Prévot insisted he saw a lake. Saint-Exupéry tried to dissuade him, knowing it was a mirage or hallucination, but Prévot walked toward it anyway, moving like a somnambulist, but unable to turn back. Saint-Exupéry was certain he would never return. Lying alone in the sand, Saint-Exupéry tested himself. He tried to summon saliva, but found his mouth sealed with a gluey crust. He could still swallow, and no lights had yet appeared in his eyes, the telltale sign that death was minutes away. He felt a strange placidity, the same unnatural calm he had experienced years earlier when he nearly drowned in the cabin of a crashing plane. He wrote a farewell letter, lying face down on the pebbles, wondering how far gone he truly was. Night came, and with it, cold. Saint-Exupéry had not expected this. His blood, deprived of water, circulated sluggishly, unable to generate warmth. His teeth chattered, his limbs twitched convulsively. He had never been bothered by low temperatures, yet now he was freezing to death as an effect of thirst. A bitter wind rose, and he made the discovery that there is no shelter in the desert. By day it holds no shadows. By night it turns you over, naked, to the wind. He twisted and turned, lay down and stood up, but the wind jabbed his limbs with ice-tipped lances. His legs gave way, and he fell to his knees, head between his hands, waiting for the end. Sometime later, Prévot's voice roused him. He was shivering violently, his whole body convulsing. "It's not only the cold," he murmured. "It's the end. All the water's been drained out of me." He loathed the thought of dying from cold, preferring the phantasms his mind had conjured, the trees and lights and crosses that had almost fascinated him. He tried drinking pure ether from their medical kit, but it felt like swallowing a razor. The alcohol closed his gullet entirely. He dug a trench, lay down in it, and covered himself with sand, leaving only his face exposed. Prévot refused to bury himself, thinking it better to keep moving. He was wrong. Saint-Exupéry felt his body fall asleep under the sand. The cold no longer troubled him, so long as he did not move. He resolved to stay motionless, and the pain faded. He felt himself being carried overseas, lashed to the deck of a slave ship under the stars. Death in this state, he realized, involved very little suffering. Exhaustion and delirium wove fantasies over pain's insistence until everything became like a child's picture book, a cruel but quaint fairy tale. He bade farewell to eyes he would never see again, to the life he had lived, to the world he was leaving. He thought of aviation, of the plowman's solid foothold in reality that flight had given him, the way it put him in touch with winds and stars and sand and sea. He thought of Mozart, played in Russian factories, of the hollow weekends of suburban commuters who knew nothing of vital preoccupations. He regretted nothing. He had tasted the sea wind on his lips, and those who know its savor can never forget it. At dawn on the fourth day, impossibly, they were still alive. Their throats, sealed by the cold, opened slightly in the warm air. They stood and began walking again. Saint-Exupéry's throat was hardening, his tongue like plaster of Paris, a rasping in his gullet, a foul taste coating his mouth. These were no longer symptoms of thirst as a craving, but of thirst as a disease, a malady attacking his body. Motes of light danced in his eyes. Once they turned to flames, he knew an hour or two would remain at most. The west wind was blowing, the wind that desiccates a man in 19 hours. They had no right to sweat, no right to rest. Every 500 yards their legs gave way, and they collapsed. But something drove them forward. All told, that final day they walked 48 miles, bringing Saint-Exupéry's total to 120 miles. His legs carried him mechanically, like an ox harnessed to a plow. He had no hope left, no grief, no despair. Emotions were luxuries for those with energy to spare. His heart felt as dried up as his throat. He thought of young girls crying over first love, of the comfort found in self-pity. But he had no tears left to cry. The landscape changed. Pebbles gave way to sand. Ahead, a line of low dunes dotted with shrubs closed the horizon. Every 200 yards they broke down again, lying on their backs until something wordless compelled them upright. Saint-Exupéry no longer dreamed of paradise or orange groves. He had lost faith in oranges. His grief had evaporated, leaving only a mechanical persistence, a refusal to stop moving forward despite having no destination. Then suddenly, the world transformed. Saint-Exupéry could not say what had changed, but everything was different. The sand, the shrubs, the dunes, all remained identical, yet the stage was now set, waiting for actors to appear. He stared at Prévot, who seemed equally stupefied. The desert had come to life. The silence was charged with sound, the emptiness loud with the bustle of a country fair. They saw footprints in the sand. "Out here," Saint-Exupéry said, his voice a croak. "Two men parted company." "And here a camel knelt down," Prévot added. They were not saved yet. An hour or two more, and they would be past, rescuing. But somewhere near, a caravan was moving through the sands. They forced themselves ahead. Then Saint-Exupéry heard a rooster crow. He remembered the words of his friend Guillaume, who had survived a crash in the Andes. "Towards the end I heard cocks crowing and railway trains passing." The memory flashed into his mind at the exact moment he heard the sound. Prévot gripped his arm. "Hear that?" "What?" "A cock." Then they were saved. Saint-Exupéry had one last hallucination of 3 dogs running. Prévot saw nothing, but both men saw a Bedouin appear beyond a hillock, moving slowly with his camel. They shouted, but their voices carried no distance. They waved their arms frantically, churning the air with desperate gestures. The Bedouin looked away to his right, seeming not to notice. Then, with agonizing slowness, he swung his head in their direction. The miracle had come to pass. He walked toward them across the sands. You, their rescuer, whose name Antoine de Saint-Exupéry never learned, would dwell forever in his memory, though he could never recall your features. You stood for all humanity, invested with nobility and loving kindness. Beyond the pale of race and language, understanding passed wordlessly. You glanced at the 2 dying men, then laid your hands on their shoulders and pressed down. Yielding to the pressure, they sank to the sand. For a while they waited, foreheads pillowed against the earth. At last the Bedouin brought a basin of water. Lying on their bellies, Saint-Exupéry and Prévot plunged their mouths into it like cattle at a pool. The Bedouin forced them to stop drinking periodically, alarmed by their eagerness, but the moment he released them, they plunged back in. As Saint-Exupéry drank, his mind rang with a paean to water, the element that more than a necessity of life is life itself. Tasteless, colorless, scentless, it eludes description. We relish it unwittingly. It thrills us with a joy far subtler than any satisfaction of the senses. With the first draught of water, the dried-up wellsprings of emotion flowed again. Within hours, both men were in Cairo, lying between cool, clean sheets. They had crashed near Wadi el Natrun in Egypt, west of the Nile Delta, on along a route toward the salt beds that ironically had once been used to mummify the corpses of ancient Egyptians. But these men were not mummified. They were resurrected. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry spent 6 days recovering in a hospital under the watchful eyes of medical staff. Doctors marveled that he and Prévot had survived 4 days without water in an environment where 19 hours was considered the limit. The northeast wind, the very wind that had blown them off course and marooned them, had also saved their lives by retarding evaporation. Their physical conditioning, their refusal to panic, their ability to keep moving when every instinct screamed to lie down, all contributed to their survival. But mostly, they had been extraordinarily lucky. Saint-Exupéry returned to France a changed man. The experience haunted him, shaped him, became the foundation for some of his most profound writing. In 1939, he published Wind, Sand, and Stars, a memoir that recounted the crash and many other experiences from his aviation career. The book won France's Grand Prix du Roman de l'Académie Française and the United States National Book Award for non-fiction. National Geographic and Outside magazines would later rate it as one of the best adventure books ever written. The desert survival became the basis for his most famous work, The Little Prince, published in 1943, a novella that has sold over 140 million copies and been translated into more than 300 languages. But the war intervened. Saint-Exupéry flew reconnaissance missions for France and later for the Allies. On July 31, 1944, at the age of 44, he took off from Corsica on a reconnaissance mission over southern France. His plane disappeared over the Mediterranean. For decades, the wreckage was never found. Then, in 1998, a fisherman recovered a silver bracelet engraved with Saint-Exupéry's name from the sea near Marseille. In 2000, a diver located wreckage on the seabed. It was confirmed in 2003 as the remains of his Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The French government declared the site an underwater grave and prohibited further exploration. André Prévot survived the war and lived a quieter life, forever linked to those 4 days in the desert. The story of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry and André Prévot is not one of heroic conquest or romanticized adventure. It is a story of persistence when all agency has been stripped away, and of 2 men who kept walking when their bodies demanded they stop, not because they were braver than others, but because stopping meant death, and walking meant a chance, however slim, of life. The desert took their water, their strength, nearly their lives. But it did not take their refusal to surrender. In the face of an indifferent universe, they chose movement over stillness, hope over despair, and in doing so, they earned the right to live. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you rethink what human beings are capable of enduring, please take a moment to like the video. It really helps the channel reach more people. And if you want more true stories of survival, resilience, and the indomitable human spirit, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.